I'm Amrit and I'll be going through some motion types in this video. So the first type of motions that I'm going to talk about are this house supports, this house opposes, and this house welcomes. So this is about a value judgment about the subject of the debate. So an example would be this house welcomes the increasing automation of labor. Another example would be this house supports the rise of websites that provide free access to open source and paywall protected academic resources. So I'm going to walk through the next debate. This house opposes the rise of social media. So like with motions from the neutral perspective, it is up for the debate what good looks like, i.e. the metric in the debate, and how we should prioritize the interests of different groups in society. So it is not presumed it is about the actor that is explicitly or implicitly listed. No model is involved. Instead, you have to describe and justify the nature of the thing you are making a judgment on. So what is the rise of social media? What platforms does it include? Teams cannot use a model to say we will only oppose the rise of Facebook and Twitter. They must define the rise of social media in a way that is consistent with reality in all its form. They can, however, argue that the rise of Facebook and Twitter are a massive component of the rise of social media. Some descriptions and premises will be factually and empirically obvious to the reasonable person. So people obviously know that the existence of Facebook, Twitter, and roughly how they work. So you can use this as a definition. If your definition includes elements which are not obvious to the common person, then you will need to justify that. For example, you cannot define the usage of complex algorithms as inherently part of social media. You will have to analyze social media to show that this is the case. This does not include defending any action to rectify the situation or change the world. For example, banning social media. Type of motions are this house regrets motions. So these call for us to evaluate something that has already happened with the benefit of hindsight, unless the motion specifies otherwise. In these debates, we ask whether the world would have been better if what we regret had not happened. And the op defends the status quo at the present date. So an example of this house regrets the corporatization of higher education. Another example is this house regrets the rise of the gig economy. So in that motion, the prop defends a world without the rise of the gig economy. Op defends the world right now with the gig economy in the form that it currently takes. However, the debate can include outcomes that will soon happen in the future, provided that they are caused or linked to what we are regretting. So the prop can argue that the rise of the gig economy has made the overall structure of the economy less stable and makes it more vulnerable to recessions, even if that has not happened yet. That is still a harm and a reason to regret it. The debate needs a counterfactual to establish a good comparison. It doesn't mean if there isn't one that the proposition team loses, like with a model. A counterfactual is what would have happened if what we had regretted had not happened. To illustrate this, it wouldn't make sense to say I regret choosing chocolate ice cream if the alternative was broccoli ice cream, but maybe can if the alternative was vanilla. That is valid. It could also be that the alternative is no ice cream at all. Why would I regret chocolate ice cream? Because I'm allergic to chocolate and so on. Counterfactuals. The next thing I want to talk about is counterfactuals are not models. They are conjectures, beliefs, guesses, which can be better justified than other guesses. So teams do not have fiat to say that in an alternative universe, history would have panned out in a certain way because they wanted it to. So prop cannot regret the rise of the gig economy by asserting that without it, the world would instead have full employment in full-time jobs with generous working conditions. They can't simply dictate that that will happen. Instead, teams must show counterfactuals to be more or less likely based on the arguments about the trends and the status of the world with no fiat involved. So, for example, prop can suggest that without the rise of gig economy, it would not be seen as a viable alternative. So more people would be on full-time employment and others would continue to seek it out as the norm, meaning overall there would be more people in full-time jobs, which is good. Because counterfactuals are not models, it operates like any other argument. Closing teams cannot explicitly contradict the counterfactual of their opening, but they have more freedom to work around it, usually by adding or being more nuanced about what would happen. So, for example, opening government says that the counterfactual is a world where there is no gig economy and everyone finds a job like usual. CG can be more precise by laying out how part-time work, contract work used to exist. For example, working at Starbucks as a college student before the gig economy. So that is an example of deepening the counterfactual. OO says that the counterfactual is where people will lose jobs to automation. CO can instead say it would be a world where people with unorthodox work schedules, for example, single parents, cannot supplement their income as easily without Uber. That is also an example of broadening the counterfactual. The opposition teams are defending the status quo world at the present date. However, they can try to establish a counterfactual as well. This means that counterfactuals are a possible area of clash in the debate. Teams will build arguments and rebuttals based on different counterfactuals and tussle over which counterfactual is more believable. They can do so by challenging the prop's counterfactuals and argue that one is more likely that another one is more likely. This is because depending on the likely alternative counterfactual, the topic of the motion could be more or less tolerable. Think back about the ice cream example earlier. This means that unlike with a policy, all teams can try to establish the counterfactual in the debate, and you as a judge need to evaluate which is more likely, or even possibly some combination of both counterfactuals can be true. So for example, in the gig economy motion, Op can say that without the gig economy, we would still have automation of labor, and outsourcing to countries with cheap labor. So many people with the limited skills would be unemployed. There would also be people who would have obligations, for example, childcare, school, who cannot work full-time. Hence, it is better that they can make a living in a flexible way. Prop can respond by saying that there has always been availability of part-time work, and it is better than the nefarious gig economy for a variety of reasons. And the clash goes on and on. To summarize, either team has fiat to dictate the Neither team has fiat to dictate the counterfactual. It is part of what teams will be contesting and engaging with each other throughout the debate. Judges have to evaluate which teams convince you more that their counterfactual is more realistic. However, teams can also agree on a counterfactual and simply have a debate about the merits or harms of this world versus the counterfactual world. In that case, you should just focus primarily on the arguments raised concerning and comparing the two worlds. So, for example, in the gig economy motion, both teams might agree that without gig economy, life would be like the olden days where people either work full-time or did part-time contract work. Maybe even agree that 0-hour contracts would be the norm and compare a world with the gig economy to that world. If no counterfactual is clear, or if there is no counterfactual agreed on by all teams in the comparisons, you should first see if any team has persuaded you of their counterfactuals. If teams cannot be separated because they have not made such arguments and simply asserted a lot, then as a last resort, you have to use your reasonable perspective as a judge or a common person to imagine what would most likely be the world without the thing that we are regretting. So like with motions from a neutral perspective, it's up for the debate what good looks like, so the metric, and how we should prioritize the interests of different groups in society. So obviously not to presume it is about the actor that is explicitly or implicitly listed in the motion. The last type of motions I will discuss with you are this house prefers X, and this house prefers X to Y. So the overall question of the debate is to compare the overall goodness of two scenarios against each other. So I'll give you 4 examples and then we'll discuss them. So the first example is this house prefers a world with a widespread belief in radical freedom. The second example is this house prefers a world with a dominant norm of not expressing strong emotions. The third example, this house prefers a cynical and pessimistic perception of democratic politics to an idealistic and optimistic one. And the fourth example, this house prefers a world in which children are raised to aspire to be single rather than married. In the first case, it is preferred to the status quo. So, an example, this house prefers a world where all humans had superpowers. Op cannot say that they prefer a world where only the morally good people have superpowers. When there is no why given in the motion, Op is bound to defend the status quo. In the second case, the Op has to defend the alternative why. So, for example, this house prefers apples to oranges. The prop says they prefer apples, the op says they prefer oranges. Op teams cannot claim to be neutral between apples and oranges, though logically it seems permissible, in order to oppose the preference in the motion. In addition to not being permitted, there's also incredibly high argumentative burden to be met. So, like with motions from a neutral perspective, it is up for the debate what good looks like, so the metric in the debate, and how we should prioritize the interests of different groups in society. So again, do not presume it is about an actor that is either explicitly or implicitly listed.